There is a version of you that nobody has been able to manipulate in years. Not because you stopped caring, not because something broke inside you and went quiet, but because something finished building something so solid, so internally complete, that the old tricks simply don't land anymore. The guilt trips bounce off. The silent treatments feel like silence, not punishment. The emotional leverage that used to send you into a spiral of apologizing for things that weren't even your fault. It just doesn't reach you the way it used to. And the people who depended on that leverage, they noticed. They called you cold. They called you distant. Some of them called you dangerous. And here is the part that might surprise you. They were right. You became dangerous, not to people who love you honestly, but to every dynamic that was ever feeding off your need to be needed, your fear of being abandoned, your instinct to fix what wasn't yours to carry. That is not coldness. That is the Sophia Stage. And almost nobody talks about what it actually costs to get there. Most content about empaths stops at the beginning. The awakening. The moment you realize you feel things more deeply than the people around you. The moment you understand why you leave every conversation exhausted, why other people's moods move through your body like weather, why you have spent most of your life making yourself smaller so that someone else could feel bigger. That moment of recognition is real. It matters. But it is not the destination. It is the doorway. And there is a massive difference between walking through a door and actually building a life on the other side of it. Here is what the self-help industry does not tell you about empaths who stay at the awakening stage. They remain available, not just emotionally available, strategically available. To the wrong people, an empath who has woken up to their sensitivity but hasn't moved through it is still a resource. They are conscious now, yes. They have language for what is happening to them. They can name the pattern. But naming the pattern and being free of the pattern are two completely different things. You can know exactly what a riptide is and still drown in one. The Sophia Stage is what comes after the naming. It is what happens when the knowledge finally drops from your head into your bones, when you stop reacting to what you can feel and start responding only to what you choose. When the emotional information you pick up from a room, the tension, the performance, the loneliness wearing the costume of arrogance, stops being something you feel obligated to fix and starts being something you simply know. Think about what that shift actually means in practice. Someone walks into a conversation with you carrying an agenda. Maybe they want to make you feel guilty for pulling back. Maybe they want to rewrite history in a way that positions them as the victim. Maybe they want to test whether the version of you that used to cave under pressure is still accessible. In the early stages of empath development, that kind of encounter is exhausting. You feel the agenda before they have said a word. Your nervous system starts bracing. You rehearse your responses. You leave the conversation replaying everything that was said, wondering if you handled it right, whether you were too harsh, whether you should have explained yourself more clearly. In the Sophia Stage, that same conversation lands differently. You still feel the agenda. Your perception has not dulled. In fact, it has sharpened. But something underneath the perception has changed. There's a stillness there, a groundedness that does not need the conversation to go a certain way in order to feel okay. You are not performing calm. You are actually calm. And that calm, that genuine, unshakable quality is what makes you so difficult to work against. You cannot manipulate someone who does not need your approval to feel whole. You cannot guilt someone who has genuinely, non-defensively made peace with their own imperfections. You cannot destabilize someone whose sense of self is not stored in other people's opinions of them. This is not a mindset trick. This is not an affirmation you say in the mirror. This is the result of a specific kind of internal work, the kind that does not happen in a weekend retreat or a 3-day challenge. It happens through sustained, honest contact with your own pain. It happens through the specific heartbreak of discovering that you were building your sense of self inside a relationship that was never going to give it back. It happens through choosing not once, but slowly, repeatedly, unglamorously, to stop outsourcing your worth. The word Sophia comes from ancient Greek. It means wisdom, not intelligence, not emotional sensitivity, not self-awareness, what you have had since childhood. Wisdom, the specific embodied kind that can only be built from the inside of real suffering, not around it, not above it, through it. And here is the contrast that most people miss entirely. The empaths who reach Sophia Stage are not the ones who felt the least. They are the ones who felt the most and survived it without becoming hard, without shutting the door, without turning the sensitivity into armor. They kept feeling. They just stopped bleeding from it. That is the line between every other stage and this one. Below Sophia Stage, your sensitivity is something that happens to you. In Sophia Stage, it is something you wield, not as a weapon, but as an instrument. You feel precisely. You discern clearly. And you choose deliberately. Most empaths will ever get here, not because they are incapable, but because getting here requires something that most personal development content is not designed to deliver. It requires you to stop looking for someone to finally understand you enough and start understanding yourself so completely that the need for that external validation simply dissolves. We are going to talk about exactly how that happens, what it looks like in real life, and why for certain people in your life, the moment you arrive here will feel like the most threatening thing you have ever done. Stay with me. Let's talk about what nobody warns you about when you start doing the work. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with growth. Not the loneliness of being alone. You have probably made peace with solitude by now. This is a different kind. It is the loneliness of changing inside a life that was built around the version of you that no longer exists. The relationships, the dynamics, the unspoken agreements, they were all calibrated to the old you. The one who picked up the phone on the first ring, the one who absorbed the mood in the room and quietly rearranged themselves to make everyone else more comfortable. The one who said yes when they meant no, and then spent 3 days emotionally processing the cost of that yes in private. That version of you was loved heavily, selectively, strategically loved. And the people who depended on that version are not going to quietly celebrate when you outgrow it. This is the part of the Sophia Stage journey that the glossy content never covers. The before picture always shows someone exhausted, overwhelmed, giving too much. The after picture shows someone radiant, boundaried, at peace. But nobody shows you the middle, the part where you are changing, and the people around you are treating that change like a betrayal. Because to them it is. Think about the mechanics of a relationship that was built on imbalance. One person gives, one person takes. Both people have learned their roles so deeply that the roles feel like personality. The giver does not think of themselves as being exploited. They think of themselves as caring. The taker does not think of themselves as exploiting. They think of themselves as being cared for. The system works, and the system works specifically because the giver's sense of worth is tied to their function inside it. Now remove that tie. Now imagine the giver, the empath, begins to do the internal work, begins to separate their identity from their usefulness, begins to ask quietly at first and then with increasing clarity, who am I when I am not managing someone else's emotional world? That question is the beginning of everything. And it is also the beginning of the rupture, because the moment you stop performing your role in an unbalanced dynamic, the dynamic cannot hold. It was never built on genuine connection. It was built on function. Take away the function, and there is nothing underneath holding it together. And the person who depended on your function will experience your growth as abandonment, your stillness as aggression, your boundaries as cruelty. They will tell you that you have changed. They will say it like an accusation, and they will be correct. Here is the psychological reality underneath that accusation. Research on what is called attachment behavioral systems shows that when one person in a relationship shifts their relational patterns, even toward healthier ones, the other person's nervous system registers as a threat, not a disappointment, not a frustration, a threat. The brain does not distinguish between emotional danger and physical danger in the way we like to think it does. When the person who used to be reliably available becomes suddenly calmly unavailable, the attachment system activates. Fight responses come online, and those fight responses look like guilt trips, accusations of selfishness, sudden illness or crisis, rewriting of shared history, appeals to loyalty, and in the most extreme cases, smear campaigns. None of this is conscious strategy in most cases. It is panic wearing the clothes of accusation. But understanding that does not mean you are obligated to re-enter the dynamic to soothe it. Understanding that is compassion. Walking back into the dynamic is self-abandonment. And the Sophia Stage empath has learned, finally, irreversibly learned, the difference between those two things. Here is where the contrast becomes sharp and worth sitting with. The early stage empath, when confronted with someone's panic and accusation, feels guilt. The guilt is immediate and physical, a tightening in the chest, a flush of shame, a rapid internal review of everything they have done wrong. They begin to explain themselves. They begin to soften the boundary. They begin to perform remorse for a crime they did not commit. And the dynamic resets. The cycle continues. The empath is available again. The other person is soothed. And the lesson the system learns is that enough pressure will always bring the empath back. The Sophia Stage empath, in that same moment, feels something different. They feel the guilt because they still feel everything. Do not misunderstand that. But the guilt does not command them. It arrives, they observe it, and they recognize it for what it is. A conditioned response to someone else's distress, not evidence of wrongdoing, not a signal to retreat. Just a feeling moving through a body that has learned to feel deeply. They let it move. They do not act from it. That capacity to feel guilt without being governed by it is one of the rarest psychological achievements a person can reach. It requires having done enough inner work to know the difference between genuine remorse, which points toward actual harm you have caused, and conditioned guilt, which is simply the emotional tax that controlling dynamics charge you for daring to take up space. And once you learn to tell those two things apart, you become extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Not because you've become cold, not because you have stopped caring about the people in your life, but because you have finally, at great personal cost, built an internal reference point that does not shift every time someone is unhappy with you. That internal reference point is the foundation of the Sophia Stage. Everything else, the calm, the clarity, the capacity to be in a room full of chaos and feel it without being consumed by it. Everything else is built on top of that foundation. But there is one more thing that makes this stage genuinely rare. And it is not what most people expect. It is not strength. It is not detachment. It is not even wisdom in the way we usually think about wisdom. It is grief, fully metabolized grief. And we need to talk about that next. Nobody tells you that the path to the Sophia Stage runs directly through grief. Not the grief of losing someone, not the grief of a breakup or a death or a visible, nameable loss that the world around you will acknowledge and make space for. This is a quieter grief, a more disorienting one. It is the grief of realizing that a version of love you spent years reaching for was never actually available. That the connection you thought you were building with certain people was something you were building alone with materials only you were carrying toward a door that was never going to open. That realization does not arrive loudly. It does not come with a dramatic confrontation or a single moment of clarity that changes everything in an instant. It seeps in slowly through the accumulation of small moments where you extended yourself fully and the other person extended nothing. Through the pattern you kept trying not to see, because seeing it meant accepting something that felt unbearable. Through the morning you woke up and the hope you had been carrying for so long was simply gone, not taken, not destroyed, just quietly exhausted. And instead of relief, you felt loss. This is the part of emotional development that almost no one talks about, honestly. We celebrate the boundary. We celebrate the decision to walk away. We celebrate the person who finally chooses themselves. But we do not talk enough about what it actually feels like from the inside, which is not triumph. Not at first. At first it feels like failure, like you are not enough to make someone capable of loving you the way you need it. Like if you had just explained yourself more clearly, stayed a little longer, given a little more generously, the outcome could have been different. The Sophia Stage empath has sat inside that feeling without flinching away from it. They have let themselves grieve the relationship they wanted, not just the relationship they had. They have mourned the person they believed someone could become, not just the person that someone chose to be. And they have done the hardest thing a deeply feeling person can do. They have let the loss be real without letting it rewrite their own worth. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing. Because the alternative, the thing most people do instead, is to skip the grief, to convert it immediately into anger, which is more comfortable, more energizing, more socially acceptable, or to bypass it entirely through spiritual language that floats above the pain without ever touching it. Forgiveness as avoidance, gratitude as armor, positive reframing as a way of never having to feel the bed, full weight of what actually happened to you. The Sophia Stage cannot be reached through bypassing. That is perhaps its most inconvenient truth. You cannot think your way to it. You cannot affirmation your way to it. You cannot even therapy your way to it if the therapy is being used to understand the pain rather than actually inhabit it. At some point, the work stops being cognitive and becomes something else entirely, something that happens in the body. In the sleepless nights and the mornings that feel impossibly heavy, and the conversations with yourself that no one else will ever hear, and then something shifts. It does not announce itself. There is no before and after photograph, no moment where you look in the mirror and see a different person. The shift is subtler than that and more permanent. It is the morning you realize that someone's opinion of you did not disturb your sleep. It is the conversation where someone tries to guilt you and you feel the attempt land. And then you watch it slide off, the way water slides off, something that has been sealed from the inside. It is the moment you stop editing yourself in real time to manage someone else's reaction, not because you are being careless with them, but because you are finally being honest with yourself. That is the grief completing its work. That is what fully metabolized loss actually produces, not hardness, but settledness. A quality of being at home inside yourself that does not require any particular external condition to maintain. Now here is the contrast that matters most. People who have not done this grief work, who have skipped it or bypassed it or converted it into something more manageable, carry an invisible wound that never fully closes. And that wound is the exact point through which manipulation enters. Because at the core of every manipulation strategy is the same essential message. Why? How are not enough on your own. You need my approval to feel okay. You need this relationship, this validation, this specific outcome to feel whole. And if someone has never grieved the relationships and versions of love that could not give them that wholeness, they will keep unconsciously believing that the next one will. That the right person, the right apology, the right conversation will finally deliver the feeling of being truly seen and valued from the outside in. The Sophia Stage empath has stopped waiting for that delivery. Not because they have given up on connection. The opposite is true. They want connection more honestly and more completely than they ever have. But they are no longer willing to accept the counterfeit version. They know what the real thing feels like now, or at least they know what it does not feel like. And that knowledge, purchased at the cost of genuine grief, is what makes them impossible to keep small. There's one more dimension to the Sophia stage that we have not touched yet, and it might be the most misunderstood of all. Because everything we have talked about so far, the stillness, the unshakable calm, the immunity to guilt manipulation, the grief that built a foundation, it can all be mistaken for distance, for emotional withdrawal, for someone who has simply stopped caring. But the truth is the exact opposite. And understanding it will change how you see every relationship in your life from this point forward. That is where we are going next. Here is the truth that changes everything. The Sophia Stage empath is not distant. They are not cold. They are not someone who has traded their sensitivity for survival and called it growth. They are in fact the most genuinely present person in almost any room they walk into. And the reason most people misread them, the reason the stillness gets mistaken for indifference, is because you have been conditioned to confuse emotional reactivity with emotional depth. We have been taught subtly and relentlessly that the person who feels the most is the person who shows the most. That visible distress is proof of caring, that if someone is not moved, they must not be invested. That is not wisdom. That is a control mechanism. And it is one you have probably had used against you more times than you can count. Think about how many times someone interpreted your calm as a lack of caring. How many times your refusal to collapse into an argument was read as not taking something seriously. How many times the most regulated, most grounded version of you was accused of being emotionally unavailable by people whose definition of emotional availability was you being available to absorb whatever they needed to release. There is a profound difference between being emotionally available and being emotionally consumable. The Sophia Stage empath has learned that difference in their bones, and they have stopped agreeing to be consumed in the name of connection. What they offer instead is something rarer and more valuable than most people ever experience in a relationship. They offer presence without agenda, attention without the need to fix, care that does not require the other person to perform suffering in a particular way in order to receive it. When a Sophia Stage empath loves you, you feel it not because they are loudly demonstrating it, but because they are actually there, fully, consistently, without the background noise of their own unmet needs pulling their attention sideways. That is what real emotional availability looks like. Not someone who cries with you because your pain activates their unprocessed pain. Not someone who rushes to solve your problem because your problem being unsolved makes them anxious. Someone who can sit with you inside difficulty without needing it to resolve in any particular direction. Someone whose nervous system is so genuinely regulated that simply being near them makes your own nervous system exhale. Science actually speaks to this directly. Research in interpersonal neurobiology confirms that nervous systems are not isolated. They communicate with and influence each other constantly. When you spend extended time near someone who is chronically dysregulated, your own capacity for regulation erodes. You absorb their state. You leave interactions feeling worse than when you arrived, often without being able to name why. But the inverse is equally true and far less discussed. Extend time near someone whose nervous system is genuinely deeply regulated, not performing calm, but actually inhabiting it. And your own system begins to orient toward that stability, not through effort, not through conscious choice, simply through proximity. The Sophia Stage empath does this for the people around them without trying. Their presence is regulating, their groundedness is contagious. They walk into rooms that are full of tension, and the tension does not disappear, but it becomes more workable, more honest, less performative, because authenticity has its own gravity, and someone who is completely themselves without apology, without performance, without the exhausting social calculation of managing how they are perceived, pulls other people toward a more honest version of themselves too. This is why the Sophia Stage empath is not just rare. They are necessary. In families, in friendships, in workplaces, in communities, the person who has done this work becomes an invisible anchor, not a martyr, not a caretaker, an anchor. Someone whose internal steadiness creates enough safety in a system that other people can afford to be more honest, more vulnerable, more genuinely themselves. And yet the same person will be called difficult by those who needed them compliant, selfish by those who needed them self-sacrificing, changed, said with disappointment, as though the change were a loss by those who benefited most from who they used to be. Let that land for a moment. The people most likely to criticize your growth are the people who were most comfortable with your limitations. That is not a coincidence. That is information. It tells you exactly whose comfort was built on top of your constriction. And it tells you that your expansion, your becoming more fully yourself, is not something you owe anyone an apology for, regardless of how loudly they frame it as a failing. You did not become dangerous. You became free. And freedom, to anyone who was depending on your captivity, looks like the most dangerous thing in the world. So here is where I want to leave you. Not with a checklist, not with a 5-step plan, because the Sophia Stage does not arrive through steps. It arrives through honesty, through the willingness to feel what is actually there rather than what is more comfortable, through grief that you let be real, through boundaries that you hold not from anger but from self-knowledge, through the slow, unglamorous, profoundly worthwhile process of becoming someone whose sense of self is not stored in other people's hands. You may already be closer than you think. The fact that this landed, the fact that you watched this far, that something in you recognized what was being described, that recognition is not accidental. Stages call to us before we fully inhabit them. The Sophia Stage may already be knocking. The question is not whether you are capable of reaching it. You are. The question is whether you are willing to stop making yourself comfortable in the stages that came before it. Tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you have station that day? Open explaining about yourself, because I think that answer will tell you exactly where you are. And I think this community is one of the few places on the internet where that answer will be genuinely understood. If this resonated, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because there is more where this came from. And the conversation we are building here is one worth staying inside.